welcome to the final debate of the 2011 IPPF season. We will start with opening presentations by both teams, starting with the affirmative for 8 minutes. You may begin.
First of all, we'd like to congratulate Notre Dame on making the finals round and thank the judging panel, the Bickel & Brewer Foundation, and New York University for making all of this possible. The violence of war, as it involves the deliberate transgression of morality and respect for life, takes strict standards to be justified. The term just can be difficult to apply directly to military operations, so just war theory, or JWT, serves as a useful tool for evaluating military operations. It provides a system through which the analysis of justness can be brought together from elements of a war into an argument that is, as a whole, just. Classical just war theory puts forth criteria that must be fulfilled to justify a war as a whole. First, the authority must be legitimate. Second, there must be a just cause. Third, the intent must be just. Fourth, the war must be winnable. Fifth, the benefits should outweigh the costs. And sixth, the war must be a matter of last resort. NATO must be able to meet all 6 of these requirements in order to be justified. It is because NATO does not fulfill any of them that its military operations in Afghanistan are not justified. First is the issue of just authority. Last year, Robert Gates warned that we must not become a two-tiered alliance of those who are willing to fight and those who are not, as this would effectively destroy the alliance. But by this logic, the alliance has already been destroyed. 3 nations account for 81% of the ISAF, and the remainder are of questionable commitment. German soldiers are required to warn enemies before opening fire. Italian fighter bombers are not allowed to carry bombs, and other countries have also avoided fighting. For nations in severe financial distress with limited armed forces, the national interests of keeping the troops at home trumps the alliance interest of achieving stated goals in Afghanistan. On that note, it's easy to forget that NATO's purpose is still one of collective self-defense, not one of humanitarianism. It was founded to protect members from the threat of Russia. Instead of recognizing this purpose as defunct in the end of the Cold War, NATO has embarked on a series of disparate initiatives that stray far outside its scope. Second is unjust cause. On September 11th of 2001, the United States came to a standstill as 19 hijackers caused irreversible damage. However, of those 19, 15 were from Saudi Arabia, 2 were from the UAE, and the other 2 came from Egypt and Lebanon. They met and conceived the terrorist attacks in Hamburg, Germany, and they gained their experience from U.S. military schools, not al-Qaeda intensive camps in Afghanistan. The immediate trigger for war was NATO's Article 5, but the invasion and current occupation do little for NATO's purpose of self-defense. As a non-state actor, al-Qaeda had its roots all over the world, but NATO attacked only Afghanistan. In fact, CIA Director Leon Panetta recently admitted that there may be fewer than 50 al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan, with no question that most of the network is operating from Pakistan. This also didn't justify the overthrow of the Taliban government. Nigel Inkster of the International Institute for Strategic Studies notes that the relationship was never very comfortable between them, as the excessive radicalism of al-Qaeda alienated the Taliban's base of support. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace noted in October 2009 that for the most part, al-Qaeda works not with Afghan radical groups, but with Pakistani ones, like Lashkar-e-Taiba. Perhaps Afghanistan was altogether the wrong country for NATO to occupy. Third is unjust intent. It's impossible to ignore Afghanistan's role in energy geopolitics. The protection of the route of the TAPI, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline is of critical interest. Given the lack of any just cause, it's not difficult to conclude that ulterior motives underlie the Western occupation. Economic elites have an interest in differential accumulation resulting from high prices facilitated by instability in areas of the world involved in the energy geopolitical scene. Additionally, the impetus of humanitarianism was never enough for NATO to stop violations in other areas of the world, such as Darfur, because its intent in this respect is quite questionable and it's outside of its scope. Professors Noam Chomsky and Gilbert Achcar explain in their book Perilous Power that NATO was initially far more concerned with power projection than human rights. Hiding invasion under this guise only creates an easier path to justify future military occupations. Fourth is the unwinnability of the war. Without the prospect of success, the war cannot be justified due to its bloodshed, ethical consequences, and creation of instability. One way in which the war proves to be unwinnable is that the Taliban only becomes stronger as the war continues. A 2008 report by the International Council on Security and Development found that 72% of Afghanistan suffers from a Taliban permanent presence. This is because international development and reconstruction efforts have yet to deliver visible results to improve attitudes of the Afghan people towards their government and/or the international community. Additionally, the concentration of troops in the south merely opens the rest of the country up to the Taliban. While the United States and NATO have agreed to begin pulling out troops as early as July, the Council on Foreign Relations notes that in October 2010 that if we do start to withdraw, it'll be mission impossible. There will be no way the war can be won by July. The war in Afghanistan has only served to push the Taliban and al-Qaeda into neighboring Pakistan, where they now have a safe haven and have even negotiated peace deals with the government. This creates a doomsday scenario where the real concern is that terrorists establish a foothold in part of the northern Pakistan to launch attacks on the west. The hardest line of the Taliban aren't really Afghans anymore. They're Pakistanis. Meanwhile, the obliteration of al-Qaeda camps has merely served to decentralize that organization across two large continents, Asia and Africa. Thanks to America, al-Qaeda is now a global organization, serving as a force multiplier to local radical Islamic groups. Fifth is the excessive cost. After the initial bombings that took place across Afghanistan, NATO sought to remedy the situation through reconstruction. Yet this reconstruction tells a mixed story. NATO has focused on increasing short-term support, yet has not developed a long-term construction plan, according to SIGAR's 2011 report. One critical part of the fifth prong of JWT is the utilization of limited means. This specifically is crucial in regards to preserving civilians' lives. As of November 2010, every night, NATO conducts 17 night raid missions to perpetrate Taliban operatives, but their failure to distinguish the innocent from the guilty causes civilian casualties. Through the use of pilotless drones and missile launches, NATO and Afghan government forces accounted for 386 deaths in the first months of last year. Furthermore, NATO efforts to create a legitimate government have resulted in corruption. U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan Carl Eichenberry explains that in areas where there is absolute corruption in the countryside, there is no legitimate government of Afghanistan, and the Taliban can deliver a very predictable justice, making it difficult for NATO to justify its occupation to the world, yet alone the Afghans affected. Finally, despite all of their efforts, al-Qaeda and the Taliban, as previously noted, have only become more dangerous due to operations. And sixth is the last resort. In October of 2001, the Taliban offered for the second time to negotiate handing over bin Laden if the U.S. showed evidence that bin Laden was guilty. UN Security Council Resolution 1373 called not for military invasion, but for international police cooperation, shutting down terrorist funds and strengthening border security. These peaceful suggestions were ignored. During discussions with Taliban representatives, insurgency forces proposed replacing NATO troops with an international peacekeeping force drawn from predominantly Muslim nations, going so far as to pledge not to attack such a force. This would increase stability, lower violence, and make state building possible, as the insurgency would impede the international force less. Replacing NATO troops with those from Muslim nations would have accomplished these goals more easily, as NATO troops in Afghanistan are the most important factor in mobilizing support for the Taliban. Giving Afghans a heightened sense of cultural parallelism would provide Afghans an incentive to decrease insurgent forces, but not give a safe haven to terrorists. Instead, NATO efforts have undermined the potential for a thriving democracy by forcefully implementing a structure of democracy that does not tailor to the needs of the Afghan populace. In addition, Afghanistan would have been able to overthrow the Taliban themselves and create a flourishing democracy through grassroots initiatives. And for all those reasons, we urge an affirmative ballot in this debate.
Thank you very much. We will now have the opening statement from the negative team for a period of 8 minutes, and you may begin when you like.
From the days of European colonialism to the Soviet intervention, Afghanistan has earned the reputation as the graveyard of empires, and yet the United States stand poised to shatter this myth. NATO forces crushed Taliban resistance in provinces and cities held by the insurgents as far back as 2003. Victory is at hand, and we must not and cannot abandon this fight. Operations are distinct from war. Military operations are defined as an act or instance within the war itself, whereas war is defined as the overlying state of armed conflict between different groups. The resolution does not read, NATO's war in Afghanistan is not justified. As a result, the burden on the negative is to prove that individual military operations are justified. We do not have to disprove all 6 tenets of just war theory to prove that we should win the debate. If we prove that individual NATO operations, that there is a potential for success, which is the primary tenet they focus on, we should be able to win the debate. Determining justice must be based in the current status of NATO forces. We will agree that proportionality is a central standard by which the justness of a conflict should be determined. We'll isolate their first 3 tenets for determining just war and prove that NATO operations are justified in all 3. The question of intent, cause, and authority was established in 2003. NATO military operations were started because the United States had abandoned Afghanistan to invade Iraq. Hence, NATO military operations are in fact justified in that they were a necessary stabilizing and humanitarian operation in that country. First, NATO operations are a legitimate authority. As an alliance created to benefit the interests of countries internationally, its authority and ethos is not undermined. NATO is based on a consensus vote. Therefore, the NATO alliance has no risk of failure and thus no risk of collapse. Not only that, it is globally accepted that the voice of the international community is embodied in the democratic process that NATO members come about their decisions with, and thus the best interests of NATO can fairly be described as the best interests of the entire Western world. NATO defines humanitarian aid under their mission statement. Therefore, humanitarian aid is considered part of NATO military operations and have the authority to conduct such. In addition, the affirmative argues that other countries are limited on fighting. However, NATO operations constitute over 70% of ISAF forces. Therefore, since the U.S. does not use troop caveats, NATO operations have legitimate authority. Second, the affirmative argues NATO's Article 5 was the immediate trigger for war, but its current occupation does little for NATO's purpose of self-defense. However, NATO's operations have aided in the decrease of radicalization and thus decreased terrorist threats. Third, NATO's intent was and is to create security and stability in Afghanistan. Only through the continued success of COIN can NATO achieve its goals and save the lives of the Afghans. The issue of last resort is the least applicable not only to status quo NATO operations in Afghanistan, but to the resolution in general. The question of what means or actor, whether it may be international police or UN peacekeepers, has long been decided. Rather than speculate about the many means that could have or should have been taken, we should focus on what is. The resolution guides this interpretation with the words "are unjustified," denoting the present. Focusing on arbitrary guidelines like last resort distracts from the tangible benefits of discussing the desirability of NATO operations, as well as how they can change if need be. In any case, the Taliban's diplomatic attempts at diplomacy were strategically well-timed since the bombing campaign had already started just 2 weeks before. That represents a clear attempt to put a temporary stop to operations to try and get back momentum on the battlefield. Also, the tenets of cost-benefit analysis and likelihood of success overlap, so I will address both of them here. First, NATO has stabilized the northern and western provinces, contained violence of 9 to 400 districts, and is working to stabilize the south and east currently. Additionally, NATO will base its withdrawal on conditions on the ground and, if necessary, extend beyond the 2014 deadline so that all key provinces are stabilized. General Caldwell said that COIN was not even fully in effect in resources and troops until the summer. To begin on the substance on these two tenets, the 2012 U.S. budget will increase for civilian aid and personnel, thus reinforcing diplomatic surge and eliminating resources and oversight problems. Additionally, PRTs and NGOs directly partner with local contractors to resolve oversight. PRTs rebuild infrastructure critical to stability, such as schools, hospitals, and food banks. This same infrastructure lacked international investment before 9/11. The result of an immediate troop withdrawal would aggravate the current humanitarian crisis. NATO ensures humanitarian relief can continue, that NGO aid workers are protected, and that basic physical security is assured to civilians. This poverty is the root cause of radicalization. Second, because of troop increases, drone strikes and air raids have been cut back, proving that operations are just. Moreover, drones decrease deaths because combat soldiers are not killed and they are targeted to specific regions. Third, NATO has enacted a task force that resolves government corruption. It tracks misallocated military and government funds, therefore thwarting election bribes and opium trade while bolstering government legitimacy. Fourth, NATO combat operations decrease radicalization by preserving the perception of NATO's commitment to defense. Withdrawal causes extremists to be perceived as victorious and increase recruitments as they did when the USSR withdrew. Second, because of NATO's momentum, Taliban members have begun negotiating and seeking intervention into Afghanistan society for the first time since the start of the war. This reconciliation would resolve radicalization and prove NATO operations just. Next, on to Pakistan. Pakistan's border is inevitably porous. It wasn't even recognized by both countries for decades. Therefore, the best way to decrease terrorism in Afghanistan is to actually limit its influence in Afghanistan. Foreign policy experts Curtis and Phillips indicate that NATO operations have caused the recent decrease in terrorism in Pakistan. Our greatest enemy in this war is our own doubt. Our nation building is gaining momentum as are our troops. The Taliban is fleeing further and further into the mountains to be crushed by coalition or Pakistan forces. And the government of Afghanistan is slowly but surely piecing together the legitimate image it needs to govern. The affirmative mass makes the plea to free us from graveyard of empires, and yet it is in the heat of the counterinsurgency in Afghanistan that NATO and Afghanistan can enter in their finest hours.